G'day everyone, my name's Kirk Nicholls and I'd love to speak to you a little bit today about something I think a lot about, as was said before, using games as a way to teach people responses to security, to assess organizations, and to find out ways we can improve and relieve some of the stress when it does actually come to responding to those emergency situations. In my personal life, in my professional life, I'm a computer professional. I currently work as a security consultant and have just had the good fortune of moving into part of the business that has been really encouraging me to play games and tell stories with my clients as a way to explore where they are at currently and to identify issues with their security posture as an organization, and to help them to gather the skills and confidence they need to respond effectively to those types of scenarios when they arise. At the moment, I'm a bit of an aspiring game designer. I've been playing for a number of years, but I've never built anything from scratch myself, a lot of modification, but happy to learn more and more. And yeah, always happy to learn something new and go somewhere new and try something new. So it's important, I think, first to have a short conversation about what security is, so we can talk about what we're trying to improve or measure. Now, you could think about security in terms of national security or security that something like a lock might provide you, but what is it as a general concept? I work in cybersecurity, so we talk a lot about hackers and nation states and people trying to steal data or privacy issues, but you'll hear about it in terms of physical security and even things like emotional security. So we've got to wonder what the term means if it is used consistently across all of these contexts. So the description in front of us says that it is freedom from concern, basically, and you that have confidence in the power of your safety. You have assurance and certainty. Now, as a security professional, I can't say in good faith that you'll ever be 100% secure. As we say about our computers, the most secure computer is one that has never been assembled, and then the next most secure one is one that's never been powered up, and it's covered in concrete and thrown in the bottom of the ocean. But since we actually need to use our computers, or we need to actually participate in the world as it exists, the effort of security, or the process of trying to achieve security, is about reducing risks and increasing confidence and safety. So one of the ways we can do that, a kind of a gameplay exercise, is an incident response exercise. And these are normally participatory events where, as a team, as an individual, as a pair, you can go through a practice of how you may respond to a type of emergency. These can be really, really useful if you have someone observing or you're trying to check your own preparedness, because you can discover what you are currently capable of doing with the tools available to you, the processes that you've set out, and the team you currently have. You can prove your readiness and increase your confidence and sense of safety because you've demonstrated that you're able to respond effectively to that situation. And you can build confidence in your team and knowledge that they can successfully take these skills that they know and these processes that they know and execute on them in an emergency. So you can imagine when a crisis or a threat or just any undesirable situation does arise, it is a comfort to know that you have practiced through this before and you are familiar with the processes, because people in a stressful situation are prone to dumping a lot of their critical reasoning processes, and it's been shown that if you practice and rehearse things regularly beforehand, you're far more likely to retain them in a stressful situation. So I'd like to ask everyone who's listening at the moment to reflect for a second and think if you have been through anything like an incident response exercise to prepare for an undesirable situation before. And I'll take a drink of my coffee and I'll get back to you. So I would contend that the vast majority of you have been in multiple incident response exercises in your life. If you are new to the work industry, if you're new to professional life, maybe not so, but a great number of us have been through fire drills as part of our corporate onboarding, as part of being in an office or in a university or even in schools throughout our schooling career. So a fire drill is a good practical example of an incident response exercise that the vast majority of people in the world, once they reach adulthood, have had exposure to. It is an exercise that you run through that is a simulation of an undesirable circumstance. The building is on fire, or it's suspected to be, and the intensity of that exercise that you go through can have varying degrees of abstraction or qualities. For example, you may or may not have all of the tabards and all of the hats and outfits required to participate in the exercise effectively, but you may also have greater levels of equipment to produce the simulation. For example, you may have experienced use of smoke machines either during childhood or in building evacuation simulations to increase the realism of the scenario and encourage you to get down low and go, 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 if you're familiar with that from your youth in Australia. The other important thing about a fire drill is that it has defined success conditions. You're trying to make sure that people have certain skills and certain knowledge about procedures, that they know how to respond to things, and that people who are both general staff but also who have specific roles are familiar and confident in their ability to complete what is required of them during those occasions. One of the major issues with these types of drills, though, and you may have seen this as well with fire drills, is that people can become quite complacent and they can be seen as interfering with the due course of people's days, that they are unnecessary, that they are a burden. So depending on how they're run, people can become quite bored, quite disengaged, and the intended purpose of the event can not be achieved as it's drifted very far away. The staff are actually negatively reinforced to think about the event. They are not actually learning, they're not actually paying attention. They may be just standing around having drinks of coffee and talking to their mates rather than participating in earnest. And in those circumstances, the fire drill becomes more of a governance and compliance exercise that gets ticked off annually rather than having the actual intended effect of training and developing staff and testing systems. So if the actual staff aren't prepared, the only good that's been achieved is that legalistically, the organization can say that it has ticked those governance requirements. Now, in my world, in cybersecurity, the analogy here is annual cybersecurity awareness training. And I'm talking about the kind, and you may have had much better cybersecurity training than the average person, but where you either have courseware on your learning management system in your corporation, and then you have to click through it, and you get to the end and you're done for the year. Maybe you do some phishing exercises or something in the middle. Alternately, someone may stand up in front of you and just read you slides for an hour. Neither one of those things necessarily change your behavior or your understanding of how to respond effectively to security situations. So we have to have a think about how we're going to frame and present exercises that are actually engaging and meaningful, that do measure the outcomes and do achieve the intended effects. So there are ways of running these exercises that are much more immersive, that have much more practical application, that can have expert instructors, that can leave people feeling like they've gathered skills and secure these things in their memory and in their behaviors. We talk about this in terms of experiential learning, in terms of practical applied exercises and things people can go through to secure their skills. And a lot of this is leans into things like social constructivism, where you can get the group to share their understanding and to support each other and share anecdotes and experiences. So that type of engagement is quite simple and helps to lift things up from the start. The other things you can add, as in this image, are expert facilitators. You can see that some general Navy personnel there are practicing with a fire hose, and they have the expert fire staff there with them, fully up in kit, educating them on appropriate use of the firefighting equipment. The other thing you can put in place is a regular schedule of events. If you are making these events immersive and you are investing in expert facilitators, a regular schedule will help compound on that investment and reinforcement with the staff, so that they will become more familiar with those processes rather than exercising them only once every 12 months. You could do it every 6 or 3. And as I'll discuss in a little bit more, if you increase those production values and incorporate some other elements, it won't just be about achieving security outcomes. You can achieve a number of other workplace outcomes at the same time with the exercise that make it desirable to run these things more routinely. So the most critical thing with any exercise program that you're looking to run is you've got to figure out what you are trying to achieve with your security exercise, incident response exercises, however you want to frame one of these things. What are you actually trying to achieve as an outcome? Is it just a compliance exercise? Then, okay, we have some loose constraints there, and we only really have to achieve a box tick for whatever regulating agency is required. But perhaps you actually want to see certain levels of performance from your staff. You want to see certain response times. You want to see certain attitudes and understanding. Or maybe you just want to see that their attitudes at the start are different from their attitudes at the end towards these types of activities. Whatever the case, it's important for you to be conscientious of what you're trying to accomplish before you roll into this. Otherwise, you can expend a lot of resources and go in the wrong directions. And a lot of this is normal design type thinking that a lot of the audience at this conference is going to be familiar with. But when working with corporate clients, I've often found that running these exercises doesn't necessarily get linked to a particular outcome besides a strict regulatory one. So it's useful to have those things clearly communicated in advance. Knowing what you want to measure, the next step is how are you actually going to measure that? And some things can be quite difficult to measure when you're talking about attitude or knowledge. Response times is a convenient way to check those types of things, but depending on how that measurement is presented to staff and how that data is presented to management and how it's analyzed and dealt with afterwards, that can create a lot of negative feedback on staff when their response times and things like that aren't handled very well. One of the most effective ways to deal with that is to measure at a team and an organizational level rather than an individual. So it is not a negative judgment upon the individual. It is a factor of the team. It is a factor of the processes that are in place, the material support that's available to them. The other essential thing is to make sure that you have feedback loops and iteration in your program. We'll talk a little bit later about the benefits of doing a campaign of these types of programs versus a one-shot, but the importance is that you want to be able to give feedback to staff, but also feedback into your exercise program to make sure that it's continually adapting to the circumstances of your organization and that it's contextualized appropriately so staff feel like they are immersed in what's going on and that it reflects the actual situation in front of them. I threw this slide in just before I started talking because I felt a little bit inadequate in front of all of the other speakers who were speaking very technically about their profession and very competently. I thought I'd throw in a little formula so I could sort of bolster myself up a little bit here and show you a little bit of a way of measuring the effectiveness of a scenario. So Roscoe and Wilgers put this formula forward, and this is used by emergency services organizations in Australia to measure the effectiveness of simulation exercises when they're developing them and trying to work out whether they are effective at increasing people's skills versus them gathering the skills in real life scenarios. So, for example, the question would be, is this fire drill training more effective, and does it improve response time compared to having people respond to an actual number of fires, for example? Unfortunately, an organization probably doesn't want to bet that their people should be gathering experience by being exposed to actual fires to develop their skills. Ideally, they would like to allow them to prepare beforehand. So the formula here is trying to work out whether the simulated experience or the training experience adequately prepares people for actual scenarios, actual emergencies, by comparing the level of experience with real world experience required to reach a certain level of competence versus the level of time in the simulated experiences. And trying to identify that ratio helps work out whether the training is adequately developed and meets the target requirements. Oop, wrong direction there. So when we talk about this stuff, I talked about incident response exercises, but the language of art in the industry at the moment a lot of the time is to call them tabletop exercises. And these have been done in a lot of different contexts over time. and local councils, local government, national security, all sorts, done these types of exercises for a long time. And they can involve different scales of effort and different levels of abstraction. But typically, they would have a scoped set of people who would attend, which may be, say, a board of executives representing different parts of the business, or the directors, department heads, or you may scale the event up and have hundreds of people participating at geographically dispersed sites, and having to figure out how to orchestrate and run an event of that scale. Understandably involves many, many more people than a single facilitator in a room like you're seeing in front of you. Now, these exercises are normally facilitated with a pre-written scenario with a number of problems and a number of what are called injections over the course of the scenario. You could call them complications, you could call them the next stage or the next act of the event. But normally you throw complications progressively at the participants and see how they solve them based on the roles they are acting in. Now, the level of production value that can be achieved with this varies dramatically depending on the level of investment that the organization hosting it or running it is prepared to put in, or that they're capable of doing. But you can run everything from straight up purely verbal tabletop to something where you have paper-based handouts. You could run something that has a whole virtualized computer environment to participate or interact with for some or all of the participants. Or you could run it absolutely virtualized and have very high production value inputs like pre-recorded media and things of that nature. One of the additional qualities that you can bring is something that's called the red team. Now, my peers in the security industry, there's a little bit of a I suppose you would call it a doctrinal difference or a difference in thinking between what red team represents to those people. People in the cybersecurity industry have picked it up very recently, and it means some very specific things to them. But more generally, stepping back into military history and national security history, the red team plays the role of the antagonist or the opposing force in any one of these scenarios. So that may be a pre-scripted level of role play, or it may extend all the way up to a cell or a group of people who have been approved to use techniques, tactics, and procedures that reflect a real threat group, and they've been given independence from the exercise to a degree to act on that list of techniques and procedures to antagonize, harass, and attack the host organization, and to see how they respond under those circumstances. Now, depending on what the organization is hoping to achieve or what they want feedback on, that may be more or less desirable, but there's a number of different combinations you can possibly have. Now, these attacks could be physical, they could be informational in cybersecurity, they could be social, as you see here, people in cunning disguises trying to infiltrate and deceive their way into a particular location. But no matter the techniques that are approved to be used, the intent is the same. You are testing the security responses and the procedures of the host organization in order to give them feedback, in order to test their preparedness, in order to increase their level of experience and understanding, so that when an actual emergency, when an actual security incident occurs, they are more prepared. So what are some of the ways that we can make a game of this? I was saying before about the level of realism that you can bring to this, and there's different levels of abstraction that you could present in the artifacts that you present to people. A simple one that doesn't take much resources at all is that you could produce something like the image on the right-hand side, where you have a newscaster talking about something in the scenario, and you could put a bug down there on the lower third, make it seem like a news article update, and present that to the people in the event step by step as updates and injections to the scenario. It could be calls from the CEO, it could be live footage from the site of the disaster, whatever the case may be. But a bit of video and audio with the tiniest bit of video editing over the top of it can provide a dramatic difference to the level of immersion and participation, as well as the suspension of disbelief of the participants. There's a lot of work that gets done by the participants that happens in the theater of the mind, which is a term that I like and I've adopted from my role-play game history, where rather than having a lot of the work done on the tabletop by miniatures and things like that, it's strictly verbal or in people's heads, maybe with a little bit of a sketch on a notepad to explain something. So your exercises can operate entirely in that medium, or they could operate entirely with a board or a physical representation of what's going on, or a computer simulated environment to keep a monitor of that. And depending on how you want to balance that, what capabilities you have available to you to achieve that type of technical effect, you can reduce the cognitive load on the participants to a degree. You can also afford you the opportunity to expand the number of people that you can effectively handle during one of these exercises and maintain their level of experience and the outcomes required for the exercise. An important factor is if you want to run this particular scenario and this particular training event as a one-shot, i.e. is it entirely contained within the experience and the time that you have allotted to you to run it, and does it have any continuity or connection to any further events? Or do you want to formulate a campaign that may span over a number of days, over a number of months? If you ran one of these once a month in your organization, would you connect the narrative and the consequences of one to the next over time? And the simple way to do that is to have a pre-briefing before the next stage of your incident response exercise, saying last time we ran one of these, this was the incident, we've made so many improvements since then, and you can dress that up in as much theater and presentation or officiousness as you may like to. But it helps the team feel like they are a part of this ongoing improvement in the way that the response and the processes are occurring. The team responded successfully to an incident. We found these issues. We noted these requirements for improvement. We implemented them, and now they're part of the next scenario, and we will include them, and we will make specific references and like hooks to connect to those improvements in this scenario. So the team feels and sees the improvement step by step. They learn their new processes, policies, and procedures. And that's a little bit of the core gameplay loop as well. You want people to be presented with a problem that they need to solve, and the tools they have available to them are their peers, the processes and procedures available within the organization, and the technologies that they have in their organization. In some cases, for your scenario, you may need to constrain them to restrict the number of things they may have available or suspend their disbelief with a bit of pre-briefing and understanding. For example, you may have participants who say, yes, I would respond this particular way to a scenario problem, and someone may point out, well, that wouldn't quite work because of so-and-so. And their response will be, yes, but my staff know how to do that, of course. They don't need that written down, they already know. Which highlights an assumption that their staff will always know, that their staff will always be present and available, that they didn't explicitly think about having to go through that process. So that's a thing to note as you run the exercise. That's a thing to bring out in any analysis or feedback you have afterwards, and to review if there's a requirement for improvement there. Some of the things you can look at for hints about how to formulate and structure these exercises, because I'm not going to tell you that there's one particular formula, although I will give you a recommendation for some things to look at if you're interested after this. The escape rooms that you'll see in pretty much any capital city. I'm not sure whether they're quite running at the moment, but they're a common reference point. They're a kind of a problem that a group is presented with, perhaps with a time limit, particular window dressing and production value, and they need to attempt to handle that problem to escape the scenario in time. This is a useful way to think about it, along with fire drills, about how you can structure these kinds of things to help people solve problems and address issues. And while under observation, you can assess how they've approached those problems. Since the pandemic has rolled out, there's been a number of online escape room systems that have been set up that have outstanding production value involved with them, and really make for an incredible team experience where everyone can participate digitally without having to touch or be present physically. And that's been an incredible development. I've been really happy doing some work with them. The other places that you can look are the card games, board games, and role-play games that you may be familiar with. All of the same gameplay mechanics and conceits that you're probably familiar with from your careers as games developers can be applied to these types of incident scenarios. The key matter is always Does it simulate the actual processes? Does it simulate the actual threat? And is it measuring and providing feedback appropriately?
Cool. I have to jump in now because we are out of time.
Cool.
But super interesting talk. As a game designer, I love thinking about the real world stuff compared to game loops and simulating things in real time. I love this type of thing. But thank you so much for the talk.
No worries. Thank you.